On a bitter January morning in 1996, in a modest brick bungalow on Chicago's South Side, 23-year-old Maria Cordova kissed her infant daughter goodbye and stepped out into the freezing dawn to catch the bus to her factory job. She never arrived at work. Her body was found 3 days later in an abandoned warehouse 6 miles from her home, strangled with a ligature, her winter coat folded neatly beside her. The Chicago Police Department investigated. They interviewed witnesses. They collected evidence. They developed suspects. And then, as so often happens when leads dry up and public attention fades, the case went cold. For 27 years, Maria's family waited. Her daughter grew up without answers. The killer walked free, hidden in plain sight, living an ordinary life while Maria's remained frozen in that winter of 1996. But cold cases have a way of warming up when the right person asks the right question at the right time. In 2023, a detective reopening old files noticed something everyone else had missed, and what followed WOULD Chinese letter shocked a community that thought it knew all its secrets. How does a killer hide for nearly 3 decades, and what finally brings them into the light? Chicago's South Side in 1996 was a patchwork of working-class neighborhoods, places where generations of families had put down roots, where everyone knew their neighbors, and where the sound of the L train rattling overhead was as familiar as breathing. The Pilsen neighborhood, where Maria Cordova lived with her husband Tomás and their 11-month-old daughter Isabella, was predominantly Mexican-American, a tight-knit community of factory workers, small business owners, and families trying to build something better for their children. The brick bungalows lined up in neat rows, their small front yards enclosed by chain-link fences, their windows glowing warm against the January cold. Maria had been born in Pilsen, in the same hospital where she would later give birth to Isabella. Her parents, immigrants from Jalisco, had worked in the meatpacking plants and saved enough to buy a small home on 18th Street. Maria was the youngest of 4 daughters, the one everyone called Marita, the one with the infectious laugh and the fierce determination to finish high school despite becoming pregnant at 22. She had married Tomás Cordova 3 months before Isabella was born. A quiet ceremony at St. Adalbert Church with her sisters as witnesses, and a small reception in her parents' basement. Tomás Cordova was 26, a mechanic at a garage on Ashland Avenue. Those who knew him said he was reserved, a man of few words who spent his evenings under the hoods of cars and his weekends watching soccer with friends at the local bar. He and Maria had met at a quinceañera for a mutual friend's daughter. Their courtship had been brief. Maria's mother would later say she'd had reservations. Tomás seemed too old for her daughter, too set in his ways, but Maria had been adamant. She loved him, he would be a good provider, they would make it work. The morning of January 18, 1996, began like any other. The temperature hovered at 12 degrees Fahrenheit, the sky still dark at 6 a.m. when Maria's alarm clock buzzed. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Isabella, who slept in a bassinet beside the bed. Tomás had already left for work. He started at 5:30 most mornings, opening the garage for the early customers who needed their cars before the commute. Maria could hear the radiator clanking as it struggled against the cold, could see her breath in the bedroom air despite the heat being on all night. She dressed quickly, thermal underwear, jeans, 2 sweaters, the puffy blue winter coat her sister had given her for Christmas. She checked on Isabella, who stirred but didn't wake, her small face peaceful in the dim glow of the nightlight. Maria had arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Gutierrez, to watch the baby during her shift. It was an arrangement they'd worked out when Maria returned to work 6 weeks after giving birth. Mrs. Gutierrez was a widow with grown children, happy for the company and the extra money, and Maria trusted her implicitly. At 6:20 a.m., Maria carried Isabella next door, the baby bundled in blankets against the cold. Mrs. Gutierrez would later remember every detail of that moment. How Maria had seemed tired but cheerful. How she'd reminded Mrs. Gutierrez that there were extra bottles in the diaper bag. How she'd kissed Isabella's forehead and whispered, "Mommy will be back soon." Mrs. Gutierrez stood in her doorway, watching Maria walk down the icy sidewalk toward the bus stop on 18th Street, her breath forming clouds in the frozen air. It was the last time anyone who knew Maria would see her alive. The bus stop was 3 blocks from Maria's house, at the corner of 18th and Ashland. Maria needed to catch the 6:35 a.m. bus to make it to Midwest Manufacturing by 7, where she worked the assembly line, inspecting plastic components for automotive parts. It was monotonous work, standing for 8 hours in a fluorescent-lit warehouse, but it paid $9 an hour and offered health insurance, and Maria had told her sisters she was grateful to have it. The bus driver on the 6:35 route that morning was a 20-year veteran of the CTA named Donald Pierce. When police interviewed him 3 days later, he would say he didn't remember Maria boarding that morning, but he couldn't be certain. There were always several passengers at that stop, factory workers and cleaning staff heading to various jobs across the city, and after 2 decades of driving the same route, the faces blurred together. "I might have seen her," he told detectives, "but I couldn't swear to it." What investigators would later establish was this: Maria did not clock in at Midwest Manufacturing that morning. Her supervisor, a man named Robert Chen, would tell police that Maria had been reliable, never late, never absent without calling. When she didn't appear by 7:15, he'd called her home number. No answer. He tried twice more during the morning, growing concerned. By noon, he'd called Maria's emergency contact, her older sister Rosa. Rosa Cordova Delgado received the call at her home in the neighboring suburb of Cicero. She worked nights as a nurse at Cook County Hospital and had been sleeping when the phone rang. "I knew something was wrong immediately," she would later say. "Maria would never miss work without calling. Never." Rosa tried Maria's home phone. No answer. She tried Tomás at the garage. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Have you heard from Maria?" Rosa asked. "No, why?" Tomás's voice was flat, unconcerned. "She didn't show up to work. They've been calling all morning." There was a pause. Then Tomás said, "Maybe she's sick. Maybe she went back home after dropping off Isabella." "I'm coming over," Rosa said. She arrived at Maria and Tomás's house at 1:30 p.m. The front door was locked. Rosa used the spare key Maria had given her, calling her sister's name as she entered. The house was cold. The radiator had stopped clanking, the thermostat turned down low. The bed was made. Maria's purse sat on the kitchen table, her wallet inside, her house keys beside it. Her work boots, the steel-toed ones she wore at the factory, sat by the back door. Rosa's hands were shaking as she called Mrs. Gutierrez. "Is Isabella there?" Yes, she's fine. Maria hasn't come for her." "Maria's missing." Rosa called the police at 1:45 p.m. The dispatcher took down the information, but there was little urgency in her voice. Maria had been gone less than 8 hours, an adult, presumably capable of making her own decisions. "Give it 24 hours, the dispatcher said. "Most missing persons turn up." But Rosa knew her sister. Maria wouldn't leave Isabella. Maria wouldn't miss work without calling. Something was terribly wrong. Clear's throat. By evening, as the temperature dropped to 6 degrees and frost formed thick on the windows, Rosa had mobilized the family. Her other sisters, Lucia and Carmen, arrived with their husbands. Maria's parents, both in their 60s, came from their house on 18th Street, her mother clutching a rosary, her father's face set in grim lines. They gathered in Maria's small living room, the space crowded and tense, and began making calls. Friends, co-workers, the hospitals, the county jail, in case Maria had been arrested for some inconceivable reason. Tomás arrived home from the garage at 6:30, his usual time. Those who were there that evening would remember how calm he seemed, how he'd taken off his work jacket and hung it by the door, how he'd asked if anyone wanted coffee before joining the search efforts. "It struck me as odd," Rosa would later say. "Everyone else was frantic and he seemed inconvenienced, like we were overreacting." Tomás told them Maria had left for work as usual that morning. He'd been asleep when she got up. He often was, since his own shift started so early. He hadn't spoken to her, hadn't seen her. "She was fine yesterday," he said. "We watched TV after dinner. She gave Isabella a bath. Everything was normal." "Did you have a fight?" Rosa asked. Tomás looked at her, his expression unreadable. "No, why would you ask that?" "Because my sister is missing, Tomás. Because she didn't get on that bus this morning, or if she did, she never made it to work, and her purse is here, and her keys are here, and something is very wrong." "I don't know where she is," Tomás said quietly. The family organized a search that night, despite the cold, despite the darkness. They walked the route from the house to the bus stop, flashlights cutting through the frozen air, calling Maria's name. They checked the alleys, the empty lots, the spaces between buildings where someone might have fallen, might be lying injured. They found nothing. The streets were empty, the neighborhood locked down against the brutal cold. At 10 p.m., Rosa filed an official missing person report at the 12th District Police Station. The officer who took her statement was sympathetic but non-committal. Young women sometimes left home. Marital problems, postpartum depression. "We'll look into it," he assured her. But by January 19th, when Maria had been missing for 36 hours, the Chicago Police Department began to take the case seriously. Detectives Raymond Kowalski and Patricia Delgado, no relation to Maria's family, were assigned to the investigation. They started with the basics, interviewing family members, checking financial records, contacting the bus company for any surveillance footage from the route. The bus stop at 18th and Ashland had no cameras. In 1996, surveillance technology was far less ubiquitous than it would become in later decades. The nearest camera was at a currency exchange 3 blocks south, and its footage showed nothing relevant. Detective Kowalski obtained Maria's bank records. There had been no activity on her account since January 17th, when she'd withdrawn $20 from an ATM near her home. Her social security number hadn't been used. Her name hadn't appeared in any hospital or police records outside of Chicago. On January 20th, the search expanded. Volunteers from the neighborhood joined police in a systematic sweep of the area, checking abandoned buildings, parks, underpasses. The media picked up the story. A young mother missing in the middle of winter, an infant left behind. Maria's photograph appeared on the 10 o'clock news, her face smiling from what looked like a holiday gathering, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes bright with life that now might be extinguished. Tomás appeared at a press conference organized by Rosa and the family. He stood before the cameras, his face drawn, and read from a prepared statement. "Maria, if you can hear this, please come home. Isabella needs you. I need you. We all love you and we just want you safe." His voice cracked on the word safe, and he turned away from the microphones, his shoulders shaking. But some of the detectives, watching from the back of the room, exchanged glances. There was something rehearsed about Tomás's performance, something that didn't quite ring true. Detective Delgado would later write in her notes. Subject showed appropriate emotion, but timing seemed off. Watched for camera positions before speaking. Demeanor changed immediately after cameras turned off, became composed, almost businesslike. On January 21st, a Sunday, a group of volunteers searching an area near the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, about 6 miles southwest of the Cordova home, found what they'd been dreading. Behind an abandoned warehouse on South Kedzie Avenue, partially concealed by snow-covered debris, lay a blue winter coat. It was the coat Maria had been wearing when she left her house 3 days earlier. Her sister Rosa identified it immediately by the torn pocket lining, a small defect she'd noticed when she'd given Maria the coat at Christmas. Police cordoned off the area. A thorough search of the warehouse and surrounding grounds began at 3 p.m. as the winter sun slanted low through the broken windows. At 4:15, as darkness began to fall, an officer found Maria. She was inside the warehouse, in what had once been a storage room, her body positioned behind a rusted metal shelving unit. She was fully clothed except for her coat. There were no obvious signs of sexual assault, no evidence of a robbery. She still wore her small gold crucifix on a chain around her neck. The cause of death was immediately apparent. A ligature had been tightened around her neck with such force that it had bruised the skin in a clear, dark line. The ligature itself was gone, removed by the killer. Beside her body, folded with eerie care, was her blue winter coat. The medical examiner would later determine that Maria had died within hours of her disappearance, likely between 7 and 10 a.m. on January 18th. The body showed early signs of decomposition, consistent with exposure to cold temperatures for approximately 72 hours. There were defense wounds on her hands, scratches and bruises suggesting she had fought her attacker. Tissue samples under her fingernails contained skin cells that were not her own. The warehouse was processed as a crime scene. Footprints in the dust, cigarette butts, a discarded beer bottle, but the space had been used by homeless individuals and urban explorers for years. The forensic evidence was contaminated, overlapping, nearly useless. The one clear finding, tire tracks in the alley behind the warehouse, fresh enough to have been made within the last few days, pressed into a patch of ground sheltered from recent snowfall. The tracks matched a common tire size. Hundreds of vehicles in Chicago would have similar treads. Clear's throat. The news of Maria's death sent shockwaves through the community. The church held a vigil. Hundreds of people came, holding candles against the winter wind, praying for a young mother whose life had been stolen. Rosa Cordova Delgado stood before the gathering and said, "My sister was the kindest person I knew. She didn't deserve this. Whoever did this, they will be found. They will answer for what they've done." But as the investigation intensified, detectives found themselves facing more questions than answers. The timeline was puzzling. If Maria had been killed between 7 and 10 a.m., where had the abduction occurred? She'd left Mrs. Gutierrez's house at approximately 6:25, heading toward the bus stop 3 blocks away. Had someone grabbed her off the street in the pre-dawn darkness? Had she been forced into a vehicle? Detectives Kowalski and Delgado canvassed the area around 18th and Ashland. They found one witness, a man named Vincent Torres who worked the early shift at a bakery on Ashland. He'd been outside smoking at around 6:30 that morning and had seen a young woman matching Maria's description walking toward the bus stop. She was alone, he told detectives. I didn't see anyone approach her, but I went back inside after a minute. It was too cold to stand around. He couldn't say if Maria had been at the bus stop when the 6:35 bus arrived because he'd been in the back of the bakery by then, pulling trays from the oven. Police also interviewed Tomás extensively. He came in voluntarily for questioning on January 22nd, the day after Maria's body was found. He sat across from Detectives Kowalski and Delgado in an interview room at the 12th District Station, his hands folded on the table, his expression somber but cooperative. Walk us through the morning of the 18th, Detective Kowalski said. I got up at 4:45, Tomás said. I showered, got dressed, made coffee. Maria was still asleep. The baby was asleep. I left the house at 5:10, 5:15 maybe. I drove to the garage. I opened up at 5:30 like always. You drove? Yes, my truck. What kind of truck? 94 Ford Ranger, blue. Detective Delgado made a note. Where did you park when you got to the garage? In the lot behind the building, where I always park. And you were there all day? Until 6 p.m. My boss, Ray Martinez, he can tell you. I worked on 4, maybe 5 cars that day. There's a log. Did you leave at any point? Lunch break, errand? Tomás hesitated just for a moment. I went to get lunch around noon. There's a taqueria 2 blocks from the garage. I was gone maybe 20 minutes. Did you drive or walk? Walked, it's close. When did you find out Maria was missing? Her sister called me, around 1:30. She said Maria hadn't shown up to work. How did you react? I was confused, worried. I thought maybe she'd felt sick, gone back home. But you didn't go home to check. I had cars I was working on. I figured Rosa would check. She has a key. Detective Kowalski leaned forward. Your wife is missing and you kept working on cars. I didn't know she was missing, Tomás said, his voice rising slightly. I thought there was some confusion. I thought she'd turn up. When did you start to think something was seriously wrong? When Rosa called back later. When she said Maria's purse was at home, her keys were there. That's when I knew. But you didn't leave work then either. You worked until 6. My boss said he'd dock my pay if I left. We needed the money. I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe the police would find her. Detectives asked about his marriage. Tomás said it was good, no major problems. Yes, money was tight with a new baby, but they were managing. No, they hadn't been fighting. No, Maria hadn't been depressed or talked about leaving. She loved Isabella, Tomás said. She would never leave Isabella. Did your wife have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her? No, everyone loved Maria. What about you, Mr. Cordova? Did anyone have a reason to hurt you by hurting your wife? Tomás's jaw tightened. No. They asked for permission to search his truck. He agreed immediately, signing the consent form without hesitation. They asked for a DNA sample. Again, he agreed, opening his mouth for the cheek swab without protest. I want you to find who did this, he said. I want them to pay. But as the interview concluded and Tomás left the station, Detective Delgado turned to her partner and said quietly, He's too calm. His wife is dead and he's too calm. The forensic examination of Tomás's truck revealed nothing immediately incriminating. The vehicle was clean, suspiciously clean, some thought, for a mechanic's work truck. There were no bloodstains, no fibers matching Maria's clothing, no evidence she'd ever been inside. The tires matched the tread pattern found behind the warehouse, but so did thousands of other vehicles in the city. The DNA from the skin cells under Maria's fingernails was processed, a slow procedure in 1996, before the technology became faster and more accessible. It would be weeks before results came back, and when they did, there was no match in any database. The DNA belonged to a male, not Tomás Cordova, but that didn't exonerate him. It simply meant that if he was involved, someone else had done the physical killing. Detectives expanded their investigation. They looked into Maria's coworkers at Midwest Manufacturing. They interviewed friends from her church, neighbors, family members. Every lead seemed to dissolve into nothing. Maria had no secret life, no hidden conflicts, no reason anyone could fathom for someone to want her dead. The warehouse where her body had been found was in an industrial area far from her home or work. There was no clear reason Maria would have been there voluntarily. No bus route passed nearby. The few people who worked in the surrounding businesses, a trucking company, a plastics manufacturer, said they hadn't seen anything unusual on the morning of January 18th. The area was largely deserted at dawn. One detail troubled the investigators: the folded coat. Whoever had killed Maria had taken the time to remove her coat and fold it carefully before leaving it beside her body. It was an intimate gesture, almost tender, completely at odds with the violence of strangulation. "It suggests someone who knew her," Detective Kowalski said during a case review meeting, "or someone who wanted us to think they knew her." There was another puzzling element: the timeline. If Maria had been abducted near the bus stop at approximately 6:35 a.m. and killed within a few hours, the killer had to have transported her 6 miles across the city, murdered her, and disposed of her body all before mid-morning on a weekday. It was possible but risky. Broad daylight, traffic, potential witnesses. Why take that chance unless it was necessary? Unless the killer had no choice about the timing? Detectives Kowalski and Delgado kept circling back to Tomás. His timeline was convenient. He'd been at work, surrounded by potential alibis. But Ray Martinez, his boss at the garage, admitted that the shop was often unstaffed for periods when mechanics were working in the bays in back. "I don't stand over them," Martinez said. "They clock in, they work on the cars, they clock out. Could someone leave for an hour without me noticing? Yeah, probably." They checked Tomás's truck odometer, comparing the reading to his stated movements. The mileage was consistent with his daily commute and regular work-related driving, but odometers could be rolled back. It wasn't proof of anything. The investigation consumed February and March of 1996. The detectives pursued every possible lead, conducted dozens of interviews, sent evidence to multiple labs. But gradually, inevitably, the case began to cool. There were other crimes, other victims, finite resources. By April, detectives Kowalski and Delgado were working other cases, though they still spent hours each week reviewing Maria's file, hopping for a break. The media attention faded. Maria's murder was no longer front-page news. Her family held a funeral, buried her in a cemetery in Burr Oak, her grave marked by a simple stone with her name and dates, and the words "beloved mother and daughter." Isabella, not yet 2 years old, attended the funeral in Rosa's arms, too young to understand that the woman in the photographs everyone cried over was her mother. Maria Cordova stayed in the house on the south side for several months after Maria's death, but those who knew him said he was changed, more withdrawn, more prone to angry outbursts. He rarely spoke about Maria. He didn't display her photographs. When family members would visit, trying to maintain a connection to Isabella, they found the atmosphere tense and unwelcoming. "It was like he wanted to forget," Rosa would later say. "Like Maria had never existed." By the summer of 1996, Tomás had moved out of the house, taking Isabella with him. He moved to the suburbs to a small apartment in Berwyn, telling people he needed a fresh start. He changed jobs, leaving the garage on Ashland for work at a dealership service center in Oak Park. He stopped answering calls from Maria's family. When Rosa tried to visit Isabella, Tomás made excuses. The baby was sick, he was busy, it wasn't a good time. In August, Rosa hired a lawyer and petitioned for grandparents' rights, arguing that Maria's family deserved to be part of Isabella's life. The court agreed to supervised visitation, one afternoon a month, with Tomás present. Rosa would remember those visits as painful, artificial events. Isabella, now almost 2, didn't know her. The child was shy, clingy with her father, reluctant to engage. And Tomás sat there, silent, watching, his presence like a wall between them and the little girl who was all they had left of Maria. Months turned into years. The case remained officially open but dormant. Detectives Kowalski and Delgado moved on to other assignments, though they never quite let go of Maria Cordova. Detective Delgado would later say, "You don't forget the ones that get away from you. You think about them when you're falling asleep at night. You wonder what you missed." Clears throat. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, not because you wanted to, but because small details didn't align, because behavior didn't match the moment, you understand the particular anguish of Rosa Cordova Delgado in the years after her sister's death. She knew, in the way you know things without proof, that Tomás was involved. But knowing and proving are different things entirely, and the chasm between them can swallow a lifetime. Rosa kept a box in her closet filled with everything related to Maria's case. Newspaper clippings, police reports she'd obtained through Freedom of Information requests, photographs, a notebook where she'd written down every inconsistency, every detail that troubled her. She couldn't let it go. She wouldn't. Isabella grew up in Tomás's care. The monthly visits with Maria's family continued sporadically through her early childhood but became less frequent as she reached school age. Tomás remarried in 2001 to a woman named Jennifer who worked as a dental hygienist. They had 2 more children, a boy and a girl. From the outside, they looked like an ordinary suburban family. Tomás coached his son's little league team. Jennifer volunteered at the school. Isabella, now a teenager, seemed well-adjusted, active in school activities, a good student. But there were cracks visible to those who looked closely. Rosa, during her rare interactions with Isabella, noticed things. How quiet the girl became when Tomás entered a room, how she seemed always to be watching him, measuring her words and actions. She was afraid of him, Rosa would later say. Not the way a child fears discipline, something else, something deeper. In 2015, when Isabella was 19 and away at college, Northern Illinois University, studying psychology, she came to visit Rosa. It was unannounced, a knock on the door on a Saturday morning in October. Rosa opened the door to find a young woman who looked heartbreakingly like Maria. The same dark hair, the same eyes, the same delicate bone structure. "Aunt Rosa," Isabella said, "can we talk?" They sat in Rosa's kitchen, drinking coffee, and Isabella said, "I need to tell you something. I've needed to tell someone for a long time." Her hands were shaking. "I remember things, from when I was little, from before Mom died." "What things?" Rosa asked gently. "Fighting, my parents fighting. I remember my dad yelling, things breaking. I remember being scared." Isabella's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I remember the morning Mom left. I remember her putting me in Mrs. Gutierrez's arms. And I remember," she stopped, tears streaming down her face. "What do you remember?" Rosa asked. "I remember my dad being there, at Mrs. Gutierrez's, later that morning. He came to the door, talked to her, took me back home. Mrs. Gutierrez thought it was strange that he wasn't at work, but she didn't question it. And I remember being in his truck. I remember driving. I remember a big building with broken windows." Rosa felt her blood turn to ice. "Isabella, are you sure?" "I've remembered it for years. But I was so young, and everyone said Dad was at work that morning, and I thought maybe I was confused, maybe I was remembering wrong. But I started having nightmares in college, really vivid ones. I started writing down everything I could remember. And I know it's real, Aunt Rosa. I know what I saw." "What did you see?" Rosa asked, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. "I saw Mom in the truck. She was slumped over in the passenger seat. She wasn't moving. There was something around her neck, and Dad was driving. He was driving and I was in my car seat in the back, and he kept saying, 'It's okay, Mija, it's okay. We're just going for a ride.'" For those who have ever heard words that rearrange everything you thought you understood about the past, you know the sensation. The way the world tilts. The way you have to grip the table to keep from falling though you're sitting still. Rosa called Detective Patricia Delgado, who had retired from the Chicago Police Department in 2012 but still worked as a private investigator. Delgado listened to Isabella's account, asked careful questions, and said, "This changes everything. But it's a memory from a child who was 11 months old. In court, it might not hold up. We need more." They decided to approach the case carefully. Detective Delgado, using her connections, got the case file reopened, bringing in a young detective named Marcus Owens who specialized in cold cases. Detective Owens reviewed every piece of evidence with fresh eyes. He ordered new forensic tests on materials that had been stored for nearly 2 decades. DNA technology had advanced dramatically since 1996. Samples that had been too small or degraded to analyze then might yield results now. And he did something that the original investigators, hampered by 1996 technology, had not been able to do. He obtained cell phone records. While cell phones were less common in 1996, some people had them, including, it turned out, Maria Cordova. He'd had a bulky Motorola brick phone for work, provided by the garage. The records had been stored in a warehouse by the phone company, nearly forgotten. Detective Owens subpoenaed those records, and there it was, a pattern that no one had discovered in 1996 because no one had thought to look. Tomaz's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the warehouse on South Kedzie Avenue at 7:43 a.m. on January 18, 1996. He'd made a call that lasted less than a minute, calling the garage, leaving a message that he'd be late, claiming car trouble. But according to his original statement, he'd been at the garage since 5:30 that morning. He'd said he never left except for a lunch break at noon. The phone records proved he was lying. Clears throat. In February 2023, Detective Marcus Owens sat across from Rosa Cordova Delgado and said, "We have enough to bring him in. Between the cell phone records, Isabella's testimony, and the new DNA analysis, we can make a case." The DNA was the final piece. Advances in forensic science had allowed technicians to develop a full profile from the skin cells found under Maria's fingernails. They'd run that profile through expanded databases, including genealogical DNA websites that had become popular in recent years. No direct match to Tomaz, but matches to several distant relatives. A genetic genealogist had worked backward, building family trees, narrowing possibilities. The DNA pointed to someone in Tomaz's family line. Given everything else, it could only be him. On March 15, 2023, 27 years, 1 month, and 27 days after Maria Cordova's body had been found, detectives arrested Maria Cordova at his home in Berwyn. He was 61 years old now, his hair gray, his face lined with age. His wife Jennifer answered the door, confusion transforming into horror as she realized what was happening. His 2 younger children, now in their early 20s, watched from the living room as their father was handcuffed and read his rights. "I didn't do anything," Tomaz said, his voice the same flat tone he'd used 27 years earlier. "You can't prove I did anything." But they could. The case went to trial in October 2023. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically. The cell phone records placing Tomaz near the crime scene, Isabella's testimony describing what she'd seen as an infant, the DNA evidence that matched his family line, the inconsistencies in his original statements. They brought in Mrs. Gutierrez, now 93 years old, who testified that yes, Tomaz had come to her door that morning after Maria had left, saying he'd forgotten something and needed to pick up Isabella early. She'd thought it was odd but hadn't questioned it. He was the father after all. They presented evidence that Maria had planned to leave Tomaz. A coworker came forward to testify that Maria had confided in her just days before her death, saying she discovered Tomás was having an affair, that she was going to take Isabella and move back in with her parents. She said she was going to tell him that morning before she went to work, the coworker testified. She wanted to get it over with. The prosecution theorized that Maria had confronted Tomás before he left for work. They'd fought. In a rage, or perhaps in cold calculation, realizing he'd lose custody of his daughter, have to pay support, face the judgment of his community, Tomás had killed her. He'd strangled her with something, a cord, a belt, something he disposed of later. He'd called the garage to say he'd be late, blaming car trouble. He'd driven to Mrs. Gutierrez's, picked up Isabella, and driven to the warehouse with his dead wife's body in the truck and his infant daughter in the back seat. He'd left Maria's body there, folded her coat beside her in a mockery of care, and driven back to work, arriving sometime around mid-morning. He'd cleaned his truck meticulously, rolled back the odometer to hide the extra mileage, and he'd played the grieving husband, knowing that suspicion rarely falls hardest on those who seem most devastated.